a professional email webinar. We're going to give folks a few more minutes to get logged in and join, especially with, I apologize again for the confusion with the link. We all, I guess, get to learn a little bit about technology. So I apologize for that. I'm going to give people a few more moments. But if you want to use the chat box, which you should be able to find near the bottom of your screen, and introduce yourself. Cindy already jumped on, so thank you so much. And go ahead and just say your name and maybe introduce where you're coming from, and we'll get started in just a few more minutes. Thank you folks for logging in. We're just waiting a few moments. We'll make one more minute to make sure everybody was able to log in. And while you're waiting, if you want to locate the chat box, it should be at the bottom of your screen, and you can introduce yourself and say where you're logging in from. If some of you see, I'm turning off, we're going to keep everyone on mute for now and we're going to keep the video off. So if you see me doing that, that's just so that we cut down on background noise. But if you want to keep yourself muted and keep your camera off, you're welcome to do that. We'll start in one more minute.
Hello.
Hello. Welcome
Hi.
to the webinar. I'm going to go ahead and mute you just so that we cut down on background noise. Everyone's welcome to use the chat box to introduce themselves, and we'll get started. There's just a few other people joining, so I just want to make sure everybody gets a chance to get logged in, but we'll get started in just a moment. Okay, thank you all for logging in. A few more folks might join, so you might hear me repeat myself again, but as we're getting started, if you want to locate the chat box, it should be at the bottom of your screen. You can introduce yourself, and this would be a great place for you to ask questions throughout the webinar as well. Welcome to Writing a Professional Email. My name is Allie Rasmussen, and I am one of the Career Pathways trainers here at Mikasa Resource Center. As you can see in the chat box, my colleague Patrick Garrett is also on the call. Patrick would be a great person to reach out to if you're having any technology issues. Since I'm a little bit busy chatting, he's the right person to reach out to if you have any technology issues. You can also type any questions you have throughout the webinar in the chat box. The first thing we're going to do is a little bit of a pre-survey poll. So there are 4 questions, and I'm going to share those on the screen right now. If you can just answer the questions to the best of your ability and make sure you scroll down to all 4 of the questions. We'll get started in content as soon as you do that. If you don't see a poll on your screen right now, you're welcome to reach out in the chat box. We are not going to use the webcam just so that we can get through the content. Thank you for asking that question. So you should see a poll on your page, and if you can just answer the 4 questions and submit, that would be great. Okay, I'll give us about 1 more minute to finish the poll. I see a question and Patrick just answered it. We will send out a PDF of the PowerPoint to everyone who has joined the webinar, so you'll be able to get a PDF of that at the end. Okay, thank you all for doing that. It's good for us to know a little bit more information. About the folks who are a part of the webinar. So as we know, email is a huge part of our lives, especially in the age of social distancing. So we know that writing a professional email can be really important in a lot of components of our life. And if you're not familiar with Mi Casa Resource Center, we started in Denver in the 1970s to offer job training. We've since expanded to create programming for business owners, young people, and all the while continuing to offer job training for folks. So since the beginning, we've been invested in helping people advance in their career. And in the age of COVID, we've been looking at changing our programming to offer more and more digital information. And just like you all, we've been using email a lot more than we used to. So we've gotten some more tips and tricks on how to write professional emails. During the webinar, as I've said at the beginning, make sure that you are on mute in the call. That is just so that we can cut down on background noise for folks, and so that you can all be sure to hear the information. You can make sure to use the chat box, as a lot of you are already doing, so thank you for that, to make sure that we capture your questions. Feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar. We would be happy to answer them, and I'll hope to get to them as much as possible. And make sure that your computer volume is turned up so that you can hear me. Typically, I don't have a lot of issues with that, but it's always good to check. So during the webinar, we have the agenda. So we've already done the introductions about Mi Casa and about me. Again, my name is Allie Rasmussen, and I'm a career pathways trainer here. We're going to talk about setting ourselves up for success. We're going to talk about subject lines, building the email, and then we're going to talk about proofreading. So in the beginning, we want to think about setting ourselves up for success. So before we get started any further, it's important that we start with some general ideas or a baseline of what professional email is. So in our personal lives, we might use email differently. We might be emailing with a family member who lives abroad, or for other personal uses like planning a vacation with our family members. But for the purpose of this training, we're going to be talking about professional emails in a professional setting. So that might be at your job or in connection with other professional outlets like job seeking, volunteering, internships, networking, or even emailing other professionals like our doctor, the teachers of our students or ourselves, and others. So what is email? It's a quick way to communicate an idea or ask a question. And for example, collaborating on a project or communicating with your child's teacher about an absence, these are great ways to use a professional email. What professional email is not, is a way to get an immediate response. So although it is a quick way to communicate, extremely urgent requests for information are better suited for phone calls or potentially text messaging, depending on the way that you communicate with the other professionals. It's also not a way to communicate sensitive information or have difficult conversations. So email is not an excuse to communicate in a way that you wouldn't in person to person or face to face. And it's not a replacement for conversations that should happen in person. So for example, sharing negative feedback on recent changes or asking your boss for a raise, these are things that are probably better suited for in person, or in the age of being distanced, maybe a video chat or a phone call. You might consider using email to set up this kind of interaction, but we just want to start with a baseline of what we want to use professional email for. And before we send an email, we want to check the purpose of the email that we're sending. So before you send an email, you want to ask, is this the best way to communicate your information? And even when we feel like we're email experts, we want to check this regularly, because it can be easy to send an email that's better suited for an in-person conversation, or potentially, something a little bit more quick, like a phone call. We also want to ask, am I angry, tired, or hungry? Because we don't want to send something that we don't mean. We can't take back an email. Once it's sent, it's sent. So consider taking a break before you send an angry email to a customer service representative for something that you got in the mail, or before you send an email to your coworker about something you're frustrated about, because it's difficult to communicate negative feedback over email. You also want to make sure that you give yourself enough time. It can be tempting to shoot off a quick email, but the reality is that strong professional email takes time. And the final thing we want to consider to set ourselves up for success is the email address that we're using. So if you're creating your own email address, that means you're not using an email address that your workplace has created for you. You all received an email, or most of you received an email from me, and you can see my email is my first initial, my last name, @MiCasa Resource Center. MiCasa made that email for me. But when we are making our own email addresses, we want to consider what the email address looks like. I have my own professional looking email address for when I email about volunteering, or when I was emailing in order to get this job. So we want to consider what our email address actually looks like, because an email address like cutiegirl14 is not a professional email, whereas a first initial, last name, and a number is a professional email address. And some sources say 76% of resumes with unprofessional email addresses are rejected by hiring managers right away. So the email address matters. People are paying attention to what the email address is. So if we're communicating professionally, we want to pay attention to that as well. We're going to now talk about subject lines, which is that title of the email. It's the first thing that people see. First, we're going to do a little poll to test you all or see your theories on subject lines. It's just one question, so it's very easy. So go ahead and take this poll. It should be coming up on your screen right now. Okay, it looks like most people have responded to the poll. And I would say that for the most part, it seems like people understand. I do think we see a good point in the comment is it's hard to know unless you see who the recipient is. That's a really good point. Sometimes we can get away with being a little bit more casual with the way we have a subject line in an email if we know who it's from. But in general, many of you picked the March 3 meeting notes, and that can show, I think, that a lot of us already know a little bit about what a good subject line looks like. So let's talk a little bit more about how we craft them. I wanted to start with this quote that says, spend double the amount of time crafting the right subject line as you do the body of the email, because if they don't open the email, it doesn't matter. And now this is for a company that is about writing emails for businesses. And we're going to spend more time just talking about subject lines for personal professional emails, not necessarily for advertising anything, but it's still a good idea that we should put a lot of thought into our subject line. And I know I'm guilty of sometimes not thinking very much about it at all. So a successful subject line should be like the title of your email. It should invite the person to open the email and give a little bit of an idea about what's in the email. So that's why that March 3 meeting notes is a helpful subject line, as opposed to something that says, hi, or read this, exclamation point. Even maybe we might say March 3 meeting notes, urgent, and that would show the urgency, but also give a little bit more information about what the subject of the email is. Some examples are March 3 meeting notes or executive assistant application with a last name. I think when you're submitting an resume and a cover letter via email, when you're applying for a job via email, it can be nice to put your last name so that folks can have, so the folks you're emailing can have another way to organize. That's not a rule, but it is a nice thing to think about. Because the reason a subject line really matters is partly because the average office worker receives 121 emails every day. So we want to make sure that our messages are read, and many folks use the subject lines as a way to organize their inbox. And so we want to make sure that we can help folks out by making our subject lines easy to read and easy to understand. So some do's and don'ts would be, you want to keep it short and sweet. So even though we're summarizing what's in the email, we don't need to write every single thing that we're putting in the email in the subject line. You want to signal what's inside and be consistent with capitalizing letters. So the example number 1 with each letter capitalized is a little bit more of an industry standard for a professional email. Example number 2 is not incorrect, but you do want to be consistent either way, and it can be considered a little bit less professional. You always, whatever you decide to do with your capitalizing letters, you always want to capitalize proper nouns. So someone's name, the name of a company, months, and things like that. And when we're considering capitalization, we don't want to use all caps or too many exclamation points. Those things often look like spam. And if we all know, spam is emails that are generated by computers or are emails. I think we all know what spam email is. And so we don't want to make our emails look like spam. And we also don't want to be too general. So meeting, question mark, question. These are things that, as we've just said, it makes it difficult for someone who's trying to organize their inbox, find the email later, and doesn't signal what's inside. Finally, for a professional email that you're not using as advertising, the standard is to not use the question in the subject line. So are you hiring question mark is just not considered very professional. You might see this type of subject line for an advertising purpose. And if you are interested in any additional information about advertising and email marketing, there are some really helpful YouTubes. I'll drop one in the chat box if that's what you're interested in. I'll do that just right now. But in general, if you're sending an email, a professional email that isn't advertising, you don't want to include a question. So let's take a moment and practice together. So please read over this professional email, and in the chat box, make a suggestion about a subject line for this specific email, using the information you have here. We're just practicing, so we're not looking for an exact right answer, but I think it can be nice to see other people's ideas. So read the email to yourself and write a suggested subject line in the chat box. the suggestions in the chat box are awesome. Let's take another minute to get any other ideas that you have. And make sure you read through what other people have suggested. Okay, fabulous. Thank you everyone for your submissions. If you're still typing something, feel free to please share with the group. As you can see, there are different subject lines for the email. There's not an exact perfect way to do it, but many of you chose some action words like fundraiser for community center, good opportunity to help your community. These are things that are signaling what's inside, and they're short and concise. So great job. I think you're definitely understanding the concept. Feel free to continue to submit your subject lines while we also pause if anyone has any questions. So you're welcome to, I'm going to go back to the email just in case you have any other ideas for the subject line, but you can also submit any questions if you have any. Okay, wonderful. I'm going to take the fact that I don't see any come up mean that there aren't questions, but feel free to continue to type them as you have them. Let's talk about building an email. So you could just see this was an example of a professional email. This is a person reaching out for a fundraiser. So maybe this is a volunteer. Maybe this is someone whose job it is to organize this fundraiser. We can see in this email, there is a greeting and introduction. That's at the beginning. In the middle is the body of the email. And then there's the conclusion and the signature. So the building your email does not necessarily need to be very tricky, but when we keep in mind this structure, all three of these components, we can build successful professional emails. So this should be for nearly every email you send, whether you're reaching out to coworkers, following up on a job lead, emailing a teacher. We want it to have all of these components for it to be professional. So we start with a greeting and introduction. We start with, just as we said, a greeting. So this is something like, good morning, dear, hello. You want to consider who you are emailing, so it should fit the audience. So dear might be too informal or too affectionate maybe. Hello might be the right one. Greeting, good morning or good afternoon are often really easy ones to go for. You want to make sure that they meet the audience. So that might be a group of people, or it might be one specific person. You can also, in the same sense, be aware of using Mr., Ms., Dr., or just the first name, depending on your relationship with the person. When in doubt, it makes sense to be a little bit more formal in our introductions or in our greetings. And then an opening sentence or two that's just kind of pleasantries, welcoming, the same thing you would do if you were talking to a person to their face. It was nice to see you. I hope you're doing well. In that example, we saw just the opening sentence was, I saw your pottery at the farmer's market. And then we move into the introduction for the purpose of the email. I'm emailing in regards to our conversation yesterday. So all of these components do not need to be lengthy, but it's a good idea to include them, to include all three of them in your introduction. Then we move to the body of the email. This is where the bulk of your information is going to be. You want to ensure that the information is listed in a clear and concise manner. You can see that the email that we had before did not use complete paragraphs like we would maybe if we were writing an essay for school. That's totally appropriate. In an email, you don't need to do that. In fact, if it makes sense to use bullet points or numbers, that's totally appropriate. We want to make sure that the information is clear and concise. And you still want to use traditional writing skills like complete sentences and correct punctuation. And you want to pay attention to the flow of the information. In the body of the email, you also want to list any deadlines if you have them. This is only going to be appropriate for some emails, but you might say something like, can you give me feedback on the presentation by Tuesday afternoon? So we want to make sure that it's really clear if we have any deadlines, and we want to list them out in the body of the email. When we're writing an email, we want to pay attention to a term that's called hedging. And although I have this picture here, it has nothing to do with greenery, but it does have to do with using qualifying phrases or words to soften statements. So these can be phrases or words that typically are kind of cautious or vague, and they can undermine what we're saying and make you look uncertain or unconfident. So I'll show you some examples. I feel like, it would be great, or the words basic or just. Or yeah, just or basically. These words can often make us feel polite, but they can also make the writing less direct. And it's typically, hedging is much more common in women than men. And so we want to pay attention to using these. And I will be honest, as I was after preparing this webinar, I noticed how often I use hedging phrases. And it makes me feel like I'm being polite, but ultimately it makes my writing less direct. So this doesn't mean you can be demanding or rude. You can still use please and thank you. And it's okay if you use one or two of these phrases or words in your email. But if every sentence is using hedging words and phrases, it ultimately doesn't make you look not rude. That's too many double negatives. It doesn't make you look more pleasant, and it makes your writing more confusing. So here's some examples of rewriting sentences that use a lot of hedging. So for example, I think that it would be great if we discussed the project. So we can see, I think is one of those phrases we showed earlier, and sometimes it would be great is another one. But if you rewrite the sentence, we should discuss the project, we can see this is still polite and kind, but it's a much more direct way to write. Another example, I feel like you would be a good reference for me. This might be in an email if you're asking someone to be a reference for job opportunity. And although there's nothing wrong with it, would you please be a reference for me is both polite because we use the word please. We ask a question so someone has the opportunity to respond with a yes or a no, and it is more direct. And finally, this one's a real doozy. Basically, I'm just looking for a professional connection to the tech industry. So we can see this uses both basically and just, as opposed to I'm looking for a professional connection in the tech industry. We can see that none of these green sentences are rude or unkind, but they are more clear and obvious. So hedging is something that we want to pay attention to so that our writing is ultimately understood. Finally, in the email structure, we want to have the conclusion. And just like this image here, this is the time to wrap up. Often we can wrap up with action steps like suggesting meeting times or delegating tasks. You also would conclude with a signature. You might consider adding your contact information depending on what this email is used for. So if you're applying for a job, you might want to add your phone number as well so that the interviewer can reach out to you by phone if that's easier for them. A few email sign-offs that we can use are things like this. Thanks is always going to be a good go-to. It's like good morning or good afternoon. They're pretty basic and you can always use them. This isn't the exhaustive list. You might find a different email sign-off that you really enjoy, or you might see some of the things on the list that you would say, oh, I would never write cheers or best wishes, and that's okay. This isn't that you have to use any of these, but we definitely would like to avoid some of these. I think love and XO are pretty obvious. In a professional email, that just wouldn't be appropriate. But also, just a dash with your name can come off as a little bit curt or abrupt is the words I would use for it. And professional emails, a lot of the etiquette would say, sent from my iPhone. We can just get rid of that kind of basic email sign off. Because so many folks are emailing from their iPhone, we don't really need to call out that we're doing that. After you send your email, we can think about following up if we don't have a response. The general basic professional rule is 24 to 48 business hours of following up. Your company, if you're sending an email for professional reasons at your job, you might have different rules and expectations. So you should know what those are and follow those. But in general, 24 to 48 hours is a good baseline. And if you're job seeking, it's a good idea to remember this as an idea as well. So the recruiter or HR manager or person you're emailing with your application may not follow this rule because they have many people to respond to. But if they email you to ask for any information, then you should be sure that you respond within 24 to 48 hours. And also, email is not something, although we can't expect others to respond immediately, it is appropriate for us to respond quickly. So if you're job seeking, I would encourage you to respond pretty quickly to an email that they send if they ask about a background check or they ask to schedule an interview time or something like that. It's also appropriate to check in and circle back like this person if you haven't received a response, but we want to make sure that we respect this 24 to 48 hour idea. It wouldn't be appropriate typically to send an email and then in 2 hours check back in. And if you set a deadline, remember to respect the deadline. So in the email, if you say, please get back to me by the end of the week, and then you check in before the end of the week, you haven't really respected the deadline. So we want to make sure we do that when we're following up. Any questions that you want to type into the chat box? Okay, I'm going to continue to move on with content, but feel free to ask questions if you have any or write any in the chat box. Oh, I just saw one. Dear is appropriate when you write an email to say you're interested in a specific job. I personally think dear is an appropriate greeting. So if you feel comfortable with it, then I think dear falls onto the list of things that are appropriate. And this might be a space where we want to also think about title. So we might decide to put, if we know the specific person we're reaching out to, we might decide to put Mr. Garrett or Ms. Pena or something like that instead of using their first name. But I think in general, folks still use dear, and so it would be appropriate. Hey is maybe a little bit more casual. Good morning, good afternoon. Let's see. Is sincerely yours appropriate for a closure? It's difficult to say, other than XO and love and a dash, it's difficult to say. I think that the things that I was consulting to prepare for the webinar said that regards and sincerely are a little bit stuffy, is I think kind of the words that people used. And I also think that they're not totally inappropriate. So I think that regards is fine. And sincerely is fine. Sincerely yours with the yours added is a little bit more intimate. Stuffy isn't maybe the right word, but intimate maybe is, but sincerely is appropriate. There's a question about the email host. So Yahoo for a business as compared to Gmail for a business, for professional. And to be fair, I don't know exactly for a business. At the end, we're going to talk a little bit about our offerings for business owners specifically. Since I'm on the Career Pathways team, my expertise is more for job seekers. So we'll have some information you to reach out to them specifically about that. I think what's important is the words before the email host. So whatever that is, so, you know, as we saw in the example, the cutie girl 111, it doesn't really matter who's hosting that. That is not professional. But Yahoo, Gmail, I think those are fine. Really dated email hosts like AOL and Hotmail sometimes can make a business or a job seeker look a little bit dated. But I think Yahoo is similar to Gmail or iCloud and some of those that I think in general, they should be fine. They don't make people look dated. Thank you for all those questions. I'm going to continue to move on, but keep asking questions if you have any. We're going to now talk about getting out our magnifying glass, but I see one more question that snuck in. Kind regards, I think is appropriate. Yeah, I think as long as you feel like it works, I think that's great. Again, we all might find the things that we really like to say, and as long as they kind of match with what we see industry standard wise, I think those are totally appropriate. And don't say love, that one's off the table, but I think we all probably know that. So after we write an email, we want to make sure that we proofread it. And as you all know from getting an incorrect link, it can be frustrating if you make a mistake in an email. So we want to make sure that we pay attention to proofreading our email. We want to check for spelling errors. Most email hosts will underline the spelling error, but you also want to check the name of the person that it's going to. As I've said, my name is Allie, and it's spelled A-L-L-I-E. And I cannot tell you how many emails I get when someone's responding to me and they misspell my name. And it feels really frustrating. And if someone doesn't know my name, then it doesn't make me as mad, but I think it really hurts my feelings when someone misspells my name, and it shows that they didn't pay attention to my original email. So pay attention to that. And maybe that's just my personal vendetta against misspelled names, but we want to make sure that we spell the name of the person correctly because it shows that we care. You want to ensure that all of the sentences are complete sentences and check all attachments. So this means making sure that you've actually attached something that you're supposed to, that it's the correct attachment, and potentially consider calling out the attachment. So attached is my resume, attached is the budget, so that we can ensure that folks are catching the things that we're attaching to an email. You always want to ask, would I be okay if someone else saw this? As we know, email is not the most private way to communicate. It can be forwarded or printed. And so we want to ensure that we would be comfortable if someone else saw this email professionally. So in theory, many workplaces do have the ability to kind of check your work emails. And so an email would not be a good place to speak poorly about your boss or write a mean email about a customer or something like that. So we want to make sure that before we send an email, would I be okay if someone else saw this? And we want to ask, will this be read in the way I want it to be read? Because tone in our writing is about the attitude that your writing conveys. And in an email or in anything that's written, it is almost exclusively about the words and the meaning behind the words. Because when we're speaking, we can change the tone of our voice to give a different message, right? I can say, I never see you anymore, or I can say, I never see you anymore. And those two things sound really different, even though it's the same words. When we're writing, we don't have that ability. So we want to pay attention to the words that we're using. We can see these two bullet points are conveying the same message, but they have really different tones. So you have to ship the item back before you will receive your money. And once we receive your item, we will be happy to refund your money. The second one is much more polite and much more accommodating. This would be what would be much more appropriate in something like a customer service interaction. So we want to make sure that our tone is conveying what we need our tone to convey. And we need to pay attention to that when we're proofreading. Things we want to use with caution are humor and sarcasm. It's not that you can never use those things, but just like tone, it can be difficult to tell that something's a joke. And so, especially if we're emailing in a professional context that someone doesn't know us, we want to be cautious with humor or sarcasm. And in general, folks don't use emojis in professional emails. There was a study that was done in 2017 that suggests that the smiley face emoji doesn't convey warmth and makes a person look incompetent. That study was done now 3 years ago now. So I think there are folks who are moving into using emojis. So if you are emailing with a coworker and your workplace has a more of a culture of using emojis, I think there can be some exceptions made. If you do not know the person at all, say you're applying for a job interview or you're networking, I think you want to use emojis with caution, or maybe just not use them at all. We want to seek balance with our tone. So these are examples of things that are too informal, right? We've already talked about spelling out words and lots of exclamation points, smiley faces, and also being aggressive or lacking politeness. Call me with a period, especially if you're emailing in a professional context, can come off a little bit too abrupt, as opposed to call me when you have a moment, please call me tomorrow. And obviously swearing, I didn't put that example on the slide, but swearing would not be appropriate in professional email. You also don't want to be too formal. I think these two examples it's very unlikely someone would speak this way. And you want to make sure that an email also can capture your voice. Because if you're emailing someone, they either know your voice or will probably learn your voice. And so it would be odd if your email was totally different than you are in person. So just make sure that you seek a balance, that you're authentic and professional. We're going to take a moment to practice. So go ahead and read this email and call out in the chat box some of the errors that you see in this email. We can assume, based on what this email says, that it is this Max person is emailing Morgan. They've met once, and he's emailing about a networking opportunity or connecting. So take a few moments and read over the email, and in the chat box, call out some of the errors or mistakes that you see. Great job. Keep pointing out things if you see them or as you see them. Great job, everyone. I think you're catching some things that I didn't even notice. So good job. This is awesome. I'm going to show a few of the highlighted mistakes so we can talk about them, but I think I'll point out a few that you pointed out as well. So yes, we've got the greeting with just the exclamation point. And someone in the chat box used the word aggressive. I would agree with that. It's a bit too enthusiastic. Now, of course, if Max and Morgan were longtime friends from high school, this would be different. But if we don't know this person at all, it's just not very professional. Not writing out the word you, the double exclamation point and the double smile and all the smileys, it's just a little bit too much. The enthusiasm doesn't come off as professional. Hearing about your company isn't a complete sentence, and there isn't a period at the end of whole, and that's something that we forgot to highlight. But also, good catch, a few of you caught the hedging in this sentence. So do you think that you would possibly have just a little bit of time in the coming weeks to meet up? Goodness, that sentence you need to read many times. You could hear me reading aloud having a hard time understanding the point of the sentence. And instead of sounding polite, it just sounds nervous, unprofessional, and is a little bit confusing. Misspelling the word happy, the word love, and someone pointed out in the contact or in the chat box something that I had forgotten. There's no last name or contact information. That's a really good catch. I didn't even think of that, but it would make sense that you would definitely in the least want to put your last name because you've met this person only once, and a phone number would be a great idea. So here's an example of a professional way to write this email that you can take some time reading to yourself. Of course, there are lots of ways to do this. So the point of writing professional emails is not that we leave this webinar and we all write the exact same email, but that we have a framework for ways to look more professional over email. So I'm gonna give everyone just a moment to read this in silence. And if you have anything that you would do differently, feel free to add it in the chat box. All right, I hope you had a moment to read through this example. And now we'll move to, we're just kind of wrapping up the end of the webinar. So if you have any other questions, feel free to type them into the chat box. I'm also going to start a survey for everyone, and then we'll have a little bit more information about catching up with us. I'll leave that here. Feel free to type questions as you get them. And also, if you want more training, so you want one-on-one career coaching, you would like someone to help you write a draft or a template for a professional email, we would be happy to do that via appointment. And I also wanted to let you all know that we have our financial services training is a training for folks who are looking to work in the financial services industry. That's typically working in a bank or a credit union. And that is starting in July. We're bringing our content online for the first time ever. So it's new for us too, but we're pretty excited about it. It would be a 1-month training that would involve self-paced learning and virtual class meetings. So if you're interested in more information about that, reach out to Javier Martinez. He's our Career Pathways recruiter. Also, if you want to talk more about writing emails professionally for a business, for advertising or anything like that, you can reach out to Javier. He will probably connect you to the business team recruiter as well, but he can explain a little bit more about what the business team offers as well for folks who own businesses or are interested in information about starting businesses. So go ahead and feel free to continue to ask questions. And also I'm going to start one final poll that's a survey about the training. So it's got a few, let's see how many questions. It has 6 questions, so please scroll down all the way to the bottom and feel free to ask any questions in the chat box as they come up. Thank you so much for participating. thank you all for your information, or for answering those polls for us. You all got my email, but I'll put it up one more time for everyone. If you have any other questions or you want to follow up, feel free to send me an email. By the end of this week, we'll send a PDF of this presentation as well so that you can refer to it later. Feel free to stay on and ask any other questions in the chat box. Otherwise, the webinar is over. So thank you all so much for attending. Have a great day.